develop a secret plan. They want to provoke Israel into making an attack. And the Soviet Union guarantees the Arab states that if Israel detonates a nuclear bomb, Moscow will retaliate with a nuclear strike. But the Soviets don't know just how close Israel is to reaching its goals. A few days later, it completes its first nuclear bomb. The most important parts of the facility are hidden underground, 6 stories below the surface of the desert. Secret doors lead to Israel's nuclear weapons center. Here, nuclear warheads are made from plutonium, and here is where Mordechai Vanunu will later work. The 2 uppermost floors are purely for show. The Soviet Union believes it can stop Dimona without provoking a reaction from the United States.
As I mentioned, the situation in Vietnam was going against the American administration. They did not want another involvement. B, perhaps more importantly, if, as we found, one of the main Soviet aims was to stop the Israeli nuclear project before it could reach nuclear weapons, the Americans were not terribly happy about that project either. And C, both the Soviets were interested in legitimacy by getting the Israelis to attack first and thus being able to come to the aid of the victims of aggression, probably even so recognized by the United Nations. And the Americans certainly weren't interested in being identified with the aggressors.
In 1967, the Soviets implement their plan. They have a secret weapon, the MiG Foxbat aircraft, with a top speed of 3,000 kilometers per hour. It's sent at high altitude to Dimona, Israel's most secret location. From there, interceptors and missiles are launched.
Anything to counter
secret location. From there, interceptors and missiles are launched.
Israel didn't have anything to counter those flights.
Another Foxbat takes off. For the first time, the highly armed Israelis are powerless. They're as unnerved as the Soviets hoped they would be. In anticipation of the expected Israeli attack, the Soviet Union readies further units, Tu-16 bombers.
They obtained orders for bombing a certain object on Israeli territory. The objects were named only by geographical coordinates, but the main problem was that the object was protected by American Hawk missiles.
The Tu-16s await their orders in the Caucasus. They're painted with the colors of the Arab League as camouflage. Their mission is to destroy Dimona. As the Soviet Union had hoped, Israel attacks the Arab Air Force. But no one, not even the Israelis themselves, could have predicted how successful they would be. The Arab League fighter jets are destroyed in a surprise attack on their airfields. The Soviet Tu-16 bombers are unable to even land on the ruined runways in Egypt, so the order to attack is never issued.
On the very eve of the Six-Day War, there was already the possibility to display a weapon. One had been assembled. And yet, it was assembled with a crash effort on the very eve of the war. Mr. Peres says in his memoirs that he suggested a step that would deter the Arabs from opening a war. And he has not denied that it was to demonstrate such a weapon. Thank goodness, of course, if that was indeed his suggestion, thank goodness it wasn't adopted, because, as I said, the Soviets, I'm not sure, would have made the difference between just the display and the use of a nuclear weapon, and there were some missiles ready to be fired at Israel in such an eventuality.
Amid this tense situation, the US deploys the USS Liberty, a spy ship equipped with the very latest in intelligence-gathering technology. On the third day of the war, the Pentagon orders all US naval ships to stay 120 miles away from the site of the fighting. But the Liberty fails to leave the area. Israeli aircraft circle above the ship. This photo was taken by a sailor on board the Liberty. The crew is certain that their friends, the Israelis, recognize them. But instead, unmarked aircraft fire at the Liberty and even drop napalm bombs repeatedly. A photo taken during the attack. The Liberty calls for backup. US jets are scrambled, but the White House calls them back. When the aircraft fly off, Israeli fast attack boats approach, firing 5 torpedoes. A photo of the battle. The Liberty is severely hit, but miraculously, the ship does not sink.
When some of the lifeboats had been launched into the sea, the torpedoes came up and started shooting them out of the sea. Now, this is something in a war situation you are not supposed to do, but it adds to the evidence that the intention was that everybody should be killed on that ship and there should be nobody left to tell the story.
To this day, Israel maintains the attack on the Liberty was a mistake. They say they thought the ship was an Egyptian horse freighter. The US Navy arrives to rescue the crew. 34 sailors were killed and 172 were injured. Even now, the survivors are convinced the Liberty was intentionally attacked.
The real reason was that the Americans had wanted the ship sunk. That it adds to the evidence that the intention was that everybody should be killed on that ship and there should be nobody left to tell the story.
To this day, Israel maintains the attack on the Liberty was a mistake. They say they thought the ship was an Egyptian horse freighter. The US Navy arrives to rescue the crew. 34 sailors were killed and 107
sunk. That the reason for unmarked planes and so on was that the world would assume that it was the Egyptians that had done it, and that therefore the Americans would have an excuse to attack Egypt.
Peter Hunnam has found evidence pointing to a joint American-Israeli plan. They show that shortly before the attack, 3 jets on board of the aircraft carrier USS America were loaded with nuclear bombs.
When they thought the Liberty was sinking, the Americans had planned and set in motion an attack by 3 fighter bombers that took off from an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, where the Sixth Fleet were based, on Cairo with thermonuclear weapons.
Witnesses on board the aircraft carrier confirmed that the jets were loaded with armed nuclear munitions, and they took off towards Cairo, according to Hunnam's research. Israel denies that version of events. It says there was never a secret plan with the Americans.
President Johnson, over the hotline, informed the Soviets. One of our ships has been attacked, and we're taking measures to find out who did it and to take action if necessary against them. Whether they were nuclear or not is again something that people have imputed, but I don't think has been actually documented. One would have to think, whom would you drop those weapons on?
Peter Hunnam thinks the intended targets would have been military bases in Cairo. The Liberty was meant to be the pretext for defeating President Nasser in a war.
There's absolutely no doubt from the research I did, talking to people who actually saw these planes with the nuclear weapons launched, that this actually happened. About 2 or 1.5 minutes before they were due to detonate these bombs, they got over Egyptian soil when they were called back.
At that point, the United States military forces were already on alert.
Before the attack on the Liberty happened, all the nuclear defense shield of the US, which consisted of bombers standing on the runways all over the world, actually, ready to launch an attack on the Soviet Union, all that was in place, ready to launch an attack.
The US military commanders had planned ahead. globally. Among the possible targets for American bombers in the event of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, the People's Republic should not be left to profit from a US-Soviet war. That is the inhuman logic of the Cold War. Did President Johnson really act so ruthlessly? The most important documents on the Liberty attack remain classified today. Until now, the superpowers had always been portrayed as helping to de-escalate conflicts in the Middle East, but apparently they were driving forces in the background. Israel and the United States have been close allies since 1967, despite or because of the Liberty. 2 years later, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and US President Richard Nixon reach a clandestine agreement. Israel is now allowed to be a nuclear power. In 1973, on Yom Kippur, Syria and Egypt attack Israel. They advance quickly, and Israeli troops run low on ammunition. The future of the Jewish state is under serious threat.
Apparently, the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, was under panic, and he used those phrases about the end or the demise of the Third Temple, and in the first few days he was apparently in a state of panic.
Israel faces a military defeat. Will it now use its nuclear arsenal? Will they follow through on the threat of the so-called Samson option? It stipulates that if Israel falls, its enemies will fall with it.
And yet, despite all that, the legacy of Prime Minister Golda Meir was being rock solid, and Israel did not violate its pledge not to be the first to introduce nuclear weapons. Israel did not even demonstrate its capability. I do believe, however, that nuclear weapons did play a role.
The Americans want to ensure their role in this conflict and gather intelligence using what's then the fastest aircraft in the world, the SR-71. The Israelis know that the reconnaissance aircraft sensors can even detect nuclear warheads. So they arm their Jericho missiles with nuclear weapons and move them into position. They want the images taken by the spy planes to document Israel's silent threat.
We see activity at their Jericho sites. So now the concern is, my God, we could be in a nuclear war here.
The threatening gesture works. US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiates with the Soviet Union and the Arab states. With the help of the US, Israel will win this war too.
Israeli nuclear weapons play a role in the understanding the United States must supply Israel whatever she needs in conventional weaponry during the war. So they did play a role, but in tacit role. Tacit role in the sense of motivating the United States promptly to provide this airlift to Israel in order to Israel not to go nuclear.
The Yom Kippur War is the first time Israel flexes its new military muscle. F-4 bombers with nuclear weapons wait for their orders to attack the Soviet Union. The Cold War has finally expanded to include the Middle East. Israel and the United States are now nuclear allies. During the Yom Kippur War, Israel kept its pledge to not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. At least, that's the view of things within Israel. But for the rest of the world, this pledge in the South Atlantic, between Africa and Antarctica.
Israel conducted a test with South African assistance and South African observers off of the coast of South Africa, and that's what the Vela satellite detected.
US President Jimmy Carter is furious when his intelligence services inform him of the news. He's currently negotiating a peace deal between Egypt and Israel.
Even before any of this had been analyzed and any guesses had been made by the U.S. intelligence agencies, within the State Department and within the White House, there was an effort to sweep this under the rug and to make it go away.
But the US has known for years that South Africa wants the bomb too, and they've known about the cooperation between Israel and the apartheid regime for its weapons and a new testing ground. It is undeterred by the politics of the racist South African government.
A few days after the discussion of the possible Jericho deal, this is April 3rd, 1975, Shimon Peres and P.W. Botha sign a secrecy agreement committing the two countries to absolute secrecy on everything that they have discussed in these meetings and every transaction and contract that they have agreed to at this point. And one of the provisions in the secrecy agreement goes so far as to deny the very existence of that document.
Israel's nuclear aid to South Africa violates the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but Israel has never signed it. After all, it doesn't officially have the nuclear bomb. In 1991, an international coalition led by the United States fights against Iraq in the Gulf War. In retaliation for the attacks, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein orders Scud missiles fired on Israel. Israeli civilians fear they may even attack them with poison gas. German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher experiences firsthand the Iraqi missile attacks and the reactions from the Israeli population.
Just as he's visiting Israel, the Iraqi missile struck Tel Aviv and the surrounding area, and he sat in the shelter and experienced everything. We seriously reproached him. We alleged that the Europeans had given Saddam Hussein military and scientific aid, chemical aid for chemical weapons. And of course, we were against the French, against the Italians, against the Americans, against the British, against everyone who'd aided Saddam Hussein, but especially against the Germans.
German Foreign Minister Genscher visited Israel, and he had to hear lectures by our Foreign Minister David Levy. He was about how wicked the Germans were that sold Saddam Hussein technology, all those rockets and so on, which was not true, but never mind.
And he kept in regular contact with the German Chancellor. We don't know what they discussed, but the result was he offered us submarines.
Once again, Israel made the Gentiles feel guilty, of course, particularly the Germans, and once again it worked. And it's in many ways made the Gentiles feel guilty, of course, particularly the Germans, and once again it worked. And it's in many ways working to this day. It works. I cannot say personally that I feel very comfortable with it. I mean, it is a humiliating position to be in. But then I'm not responsible for my country's security.
In 1999, Germany provides Israel with 3 submarines worth €1 billion. Israel pays for half of one sub, the rest is a gift. All submarines are equipped with nuclear cruise missiles, a fact not discussed in Germany.
The Germans always acted like they never understood it and never knew about it. And I'm speaking now of the highest levels in the government with whom I had regular contact. But I couldn't believe that. I think the Germans didn't want to know about it.
So why won't the Germans speak about the Israeli nuclear weapons? One politician is prepared to give some information, one of the few who is.
If we had asked about it, the worst thing would have been asked about it. The worst thing would have been if the Israelis had given us an honest answer. Because if they had answered honestly and said, we will be using your delivery of conventionally powered submarines in the framework of our nuclear strategy, then the German governments would have had to justify themselves publicly.
Later, 2 more submarines are delivered, they too can carry nuclear cruise missiles.
Anyone who has to do with security policy and with the Israeli policy of deterrence would have to know that these submarines might be armed with nuclear weapons. I can't imagine any politician who'd spent even 15 minutes thinking about it who wouldn't come up with that option. And I think you can't then act surprised by it later on. That would suggest that I was naive in my decision-making and had not considered the consequences of my actions, or that I was starting to lie because I acted as if I didn't know something even though I had understood it.
To this day, Israel maintains its policy of Amimut. Some say it's one of the world's mightiest nuclear powers and is not only targeting Arab countries.
You don't want to deny it.
To this day, Israel maintains its policy of Amimut. Some say it's one of the world's mightiest nuclear powers and is not only targeting Arab countries.
You don't want to deny it. You want everyone to speculate about it, and no one should know for sure. That is a deterrent. But we don't want to attack anyone with nuclear weapons. We don't want to wipe anyone out.
Israel's nuclear weapons can reach any target around the world. It still refuses to allow inspections and bans its citizens from talking about the subject. Israel's nuclear weapons are a radioactive taboo, not subject to the rules of a democracy.
I think that for the international community, as well as for Israel itself, time has come to find a way to address reality for what she is, for reality itself. And the reality is that Israel today is a nuclear weapon state, and it has to be acknowledged. To play games around it, I don't think it's right, neither for the world or for Israel.